Hi, I'm Tony Saldana. Welcome to our video series on professional GBS. In this session, we will cover the professional GBS operating model. This will be the second video in our Foundations module. And as a reminder, we recommend that you go through the 3 sessions in Foundation in sequence. Also, please cover the Foundation module before attempting any other module. In this clip, we introduce the concept of running GBS as a business. In order to do that, there are 2 things that are necessary. One is the concept of a business model, and then the second is the concept of an operating model. Every business, every government, every nonprofit has a business model and an operating model. And in this clip, we apply those principles to GBS organizations. Now, how do you run GBS as if it were a business? Do you start to sell your GBS services to other companies? Do you create a catalog of products or services? Do you start to advertise? Do each of your services, like payroll or accounts receivable, have a logo and an equity? Do you focus on user experience? What exactly are we talking about? You see, in the first session on Foundations, we covered why running as a business, not as a functional monopoly, is the best model for professional GBS. It is a mindset. It keeps you awake because you're constantly looking at the environment. You're looking at who is my competition. Certainly, you don't have competition within the company in the way you're delivering your services. But make no mistake, the environment around you is always changing. There are technology developments. There are new vendors and providers that could do things better, cheaper, and faster than you do. So it is that mindset of running as a business that's really important. Which gets us back to the question, how do you run GBS as if it were a business, right? Firstly, every business has supply, it has demand, it has products or services, it has competition, it has pricing, it has users, and so on and so forth. Let me use Apple as an example. Apple has a product manager. The Apple iPhone 14 had a dedicated person and a team who was completely accountable for the success of that one model. That individual looked at the environment to see who was their competition. Was it Samsung? Was it Xiaomi? That person was responsible for figuring out how to price that product. That person was responsible for designing a delightful product and service. Now, let's think about it. How long would any company such as Apple survive if it did not do these type of activities? That is the benefit of the open market economy. That is the benefit of running as a business. It works because it keeps these companies on their toes and constantly evolving. And if our challenge within GBS is that if we stay still for too long, we become a commodity, then we have to adopt those models of running as a business. Now, if that is what running as a business means, how do you double click on that? How do you go a little deeper to unpack how to organize your activities? And that's where we have 2 elements of running as a business. One is called the business model, and the second is called the operating model. And in the next few minutes, we will unpack these 2 in more detail. So let's dig deeper into business models, and I'm going to continue to use Apple as an example here. Apple has a business model, and it is a business model that's based on creating value, whether it's revenue or profits for itself as a private company, as well as value for customers like you and me that buy their products. It is the sequence of strategies the very specific choices that they make on how they're going to create sustainable value. That's called the business model. Now, specifically in the case of business model for Apple, of course, they start up with delightful products and services. And those products and services could be divided into categories. You could have entertainment as a category, such as music and video, or devices, or corporate offerings, enterprise offerings, as the case may be. Each of those has a set of suppliers. So, for example, Foxconn for smartphones is a supplier or a vendor. Each of those products has a value proposition. In the case of entertainment, it could be original content or, ease of access to the best loved music in the world. Or in the case of smartphones, it could be, great designed capabilities with great cameras and very, very user-friendly interfaces at a premium price, obviously. And then, of course, going from there, you have channels. This is how they go to market. This go-to-market could be either virtual, online, or they could be physical stores, which is how eventually they reach the customer. The choices that Apple makes around their suppliers, their products, how they create a sustainable value proposition, and of course their channels and how they go to market, and underpinning that, what is the pricing model and how are they going to manage their costs to make a profit out of this? This entire set of choices is called the business model for Apple. So if we take the business model that I just described for Apple and extrapolate the framework out of it, what you get is a series of 9 activities, which is called the business model canvas. This is something that's available. It was generated by a person called Alexander Ostweiler, and you can learn more about it on the internet or in other books. But this is very applicable not just to companies like Apple, but also GBS. I'm going to break up that particular chart into 4 pieces. On the left-hand side, you have all of the partners. So in the case of Apple, I mentioned Foxconn, which is the organization that manufactures most of their smartphones. And they, of course, have their own activities and they've got resources. And that is true even in the case of GBS. GBS could have its own offshore shared services centers or on-site centers, or, of course, other partners. And that activity system around partners, internal and external to the company, is basically one part of the business model. On the right-hand side, though, what you have is the customer-related ecosystem. In the case of GBS, that's not just users like you and me, but also stakeholders. These are the senior leaders in the company that determine just how much service that they would like to get from the GBS organization. What capabilities should GBS deliver? And, should you buy gold-plated service or just normal services? And those are all of the customer-related activity systems. In the middle, and most importantly, you have something called a value proposition. A value proposition is basically how you generate value. It is, of course, related to how much you're going to charge for the product. In the case of Apple, they don't create products that are low-cost, cheap products. They create products that are somewhat premium, but they back that up with a level of service and design elements that want customers to be willing to pay that particular premium. We're going to define what that value proposition looks like for GBS products. What is the value proposition for your payroll service or for your accounting-related services? That is the third part of a business model framework. And of course, underpinning that is the financials. It is the cost structure. How much does it cost you to create these products and services, as well as how do you recover the revenue for those products and services? So let's take that business model framework and deep dive into the central area of value proposition. This is one of the biggest challenges that most GBS organizations have. You see, in lower levels of GBS maturity, if you equate value with cost reduction, then your entire focus is going to be cost, and more cost reduction. But as you can see, a value proposition actually has a numerator and a denominator. We've tried to create a little bit of an equation here, but the numerator is the benefits and the denominator is the cost. Now, let me perhaps give an example of value proposition from real life. Let's take a choice of hotels. Let's say you're on a road trip and, all you need is 8 hours of sleep at night on the road. You may be fine with a Motel 6 or a Super 8 in the US or the lower cost forms of the Ibis hotels in Europe, and that's perfectly fine. Maybe you're getting for the equivalent of $100 a good night's sleep, and that's great value for money. On the other hand, maybe you're on a family vacation and you're looking for a great experience in New York City. You might be looking at much higher cost and higher capability hotels, and that's great value proposition too. So as you can see, value proposition really is that interplay between the benefits and the cost. The mistake that most GBS organizations do, other than focusing just on the denominator, is that they don't go into enough detail on potential benefits. The benefits could be either experiential, or they could be service levels accuracy, or they could be completely new value creation, new innovations that you never thought possible coming out of GBS. When you put together this expanded definition of benefits, as well as obviously a holistic definition of cost. Cost isn't just the cost of GBS, but also the total cost of ownership if there are activities outside of GBS that are needed to deliver a particular service, again, such as payroll. That provides you a big landscape in which you can create new products and services and new value propositions to the business. So to zoom out a little bit, to run as a business, as I mentioned, you need a business model and an operating model. And within the business model, we went into a fair amount of details on the business model canvas and the value proposition. Now, let's focus on the operating model. Every GBS organization, whether you know it or not, has an operating model. An operating model is how you take the strategies that you create out of your business model and bring them to life. In the case of GBS, if you kind of think about it, pretty much every GBS organization that you know of has similar ways of operating. You get new scope of work, you organize that scope of work, and then you might automate some of it, you might standardize some of it, and then of course you take it and then you continue to build, you innovate on it, and you create new delightful services. In addition to that, you also have day-to-day routine activities, such as perhaps manage the cost, or maybe even manage the chargeback or the revenue gathering internal to the company that you might do for your GBS service. You might also have conversations with every stakeholder on how much is the right level of service. You might have conversations with the users on how they think about your individual services. All of these activity systems is what is called the operating model. It is how you bring your business model to life on a day-to-day basis. Now, of course, in the case of GBS, the operating model isn't just a one-time series of activities. So the previous representation of a linear set of tasks is not accurate. It's probably more like a circular, ongoing set of tasks. You have new activities, new scope of work that might come into GBS. And the first step is obviously to stabilize that piece of work so that it actually continues to run at least as well as, if not much better than it did from where it resided previously. And that's what you see on the chart on the left-hand side. Now, of course, once you do that, you stabilize the operation, and then you start to automate and to standardize. And that's what you see on the top right-hand side. This is, again, a sequence of activities that happens every time you get new scope of work. Once the activities are stabilized, once you have standardized and automated, then you have other activity systems such as what do you report, what service levels, what performance, what cost, who needs to know what about GBS, right? And there is that entire set of activities around that. And then finally, you have a set of activity systems around making sure that you're constantly innovating, right? Whether it's creating new business capabilities or whether you're using tactics such as outsourcing or offshoring to continue to deliver lower cost and higher innovation. All of these activities happen around the customer. It happens around the user, but also remember, we want to distinguish between the user and the stakeholders, the clients who eventually in some shape or form are the senior executives that pay for GBS. This is the GBS operating model. And as I mentioned, whether you know it or not, almost all GBS organizations endeavor to cover these activities. This, in other words, becomes the GBS operating model. And part of the work that we need to do is to professionalize each and every activity system within this operating model. So the GBS operating model, which every organization does have, whether you realize it or not, when you put that together with the business model, is how you run GBS as a business. And again, it's no different from how Apple or any other company might run as a business. What you have are supporting activities in the case of Apple and Apple's operating model, such as their infrastructure or their human resources or technology. That is how the overall strategy of premium design products, very efficient supply chain into consumer delight comes to life on a day-to-day basis. Similarly, within GBS, the operating model of how do you take in new work, how do you streamline it, how do you standardize it, how do you continue to innovate, how do you work with your users, how do you work with your stakeholders, your clients, how do you manage your service levels, and of course, what costs do you put to each of those activities is the definition of the GBS operating model. So this combination of the business model and the operating model is what gives us the approach to running GBS as a business. And to recap, the reason why we want to run GBS as a business is that the alternative, which is you run as a functional bureaucracy, just simply does not give us the pace of change, the impetus to keep up and to react to the external environment, which keeps changing dramatically given the changes in technology. That's why we need to professionalize the business model and the operating model. The other point that I want to make is that a stronger GBS value proposition, when you are not just reducing costs, but you are creating more and more new capabilities, new innovations, like the premium hotel examples that I gave you earlier, that becomes very important because you continue to move up the ladder of value creation by providing better capabilities and by creating more value to your organization. And of course, you put all of these together into a framework which is called professional GBS, and that allows you to leapfrog maturity. Mature GBS organizations do have a common way of approaching the scope, whether you're talking about financial shared services or HR or IT shared services or procurement or anything else. They have a common operating model, and by having a common operating model, are able to leapfrog their capabilities and add more value within shorter periods of time. And with that, we hope you enjoyed this session in our Professional GBS series. All the best as you professionalize, modernize, and transform GBS.